Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's virtual Talent Strategy Symposium. I'm Rue Ramsey, Vice President of Workforce and Talent Strategies at the Tulsa Regional Chamber. We're celebrating Economic Development Week, and we are thrilled to have Richard Florida with us today to share his outlook for the post-pandemic recovery. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize our generous sponsors. Today's Talent Strategy Symposium is presented by Tulsa Tech. Our gold sponsors are the Greenheck Group and Sim Group. Our talent attraction and retention benefactors are Gable Gottwals and Tulsa Tech. And our talent attraction and retention sponsors are CF Industries and Williams. Thank you so much to our generous sponsors. COVID-19 has impacted the way we work and the way we live. As we navigate this pandemic and businesses begin to reopen, we must. Here to share his thoughts and expertise is Richard Florida, one of the world's thought leaders and researchers. I'll now pass it over to Bill Murphy, Senior Vice President of Economic Development at the Tulsa Regional Chamber, to introduce today's speaker. Bill?
Thank you, Rue, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a real honor to have the opportunity to introduce Richard, and I want to thank the George Kaiser Family Foundation for their ongoing support and work with Richard. It's been a real pleasure to get to know him over the last several months. He's just done a phenomenal job of getting to know our community and helping us set up today's event. Again, thank you to the George Kaiser Family Foundation. Richard Florida is a university professor at the University of Toronto School of Cities and Rotman School of Management, distinguished fellow at New York University and Florida International University. He's also a co-founder and senior editor of CityLab. He is also a writer, a journalist, having penned several global bestsellers, including The Rise of the Creative Class, and his most recent book, The New Urban Crisis. Florida is also the founder of the Creative Class Group, which works closely with companies and governments worldwide. And again, just a personal privilege, Richard is also briefly a fellow Ohioan, and we've had opportunities to share some of the best eating and drinking establishments in Columbus, Ohio. So enjoyed sharing that with you. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Rue. Thanks to the Chamber and all the sponsors. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm going to talk for about, I don't know, 30 minutes or so. I have a little slide deck that I prepared. And then take your question and answers. And it's always a pleasure. You can notice everyone looking behind me. It is always my delight to be back in Tulsa. Really, I mean, it's something, I was just talking to Nick Lala of Tulsa Innovation Labs. We just did a call and I was saying how much I enjoy visiting your city and how much this project that I'm doing with all of you, with the mayor's office, but supported by that Kaiser Family Foundation, how it's probably my favorite project I've ever worked on. And, you know, when I met Ken Levitt and met all of you, I didn't know that would be, but it's really turned out to be a passion project. Now who would have thought we'd find ourselves in this situation where I can't get on a plane and come visit you, but we're going to get through this. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And not only talk about how we're going to get through it, but what we can do now as you in Tulsa are thinking about how you reopen. And that's a big part of it. How do we reopen our cities, our communities, safely and securely, but more importantly, I think, or as importantly, how do we plan for the future to make the Tulsa economy a better economy? That's what we were talking about before, Bill and Mike and Rue and everybody. How do we make the economy stronger? You mentioned the talent retention and attraction sponsors. How do we make Tulsa attract better talent? How do we grow and attract those industries? So that's what I want to talk about with you. And I put together this little slide deck for everybody. Preparing Tulsa to reopen and recover. Look, this forest that we urban scholars, I have a PhD in city and regional planning. I guess people consider me an urbanist, which we urban scholars call urbanization. By urbanization, I don't mean just cities. I mean the growth of metropolitan regions like Tulsa or Oklahoma City or the San Francisco Bay Area, or Greater Miami, or New York or Tokyo. These urban clusters, agglomerations of people, of industries, that force has always been stronger than infectious disease. And, you know, like all of you, I've not been, well, I do go out for walks every day. And actually, this is ridiculous. I've lost a lot of weight, partly because I stopped drinking. You know, I figured with anxiety, the last thing I needed was to booze up. So weirdly, I'm the one guy who stopped drinking, but I stopped cycling because I was too scared to go to the darn emergency room. So I took walks. I've lost weight over the damn pandemic. But the point is, I've been able to sit here and read. And I've read, if I could show you, I have a pile of books that are holding up this darn laptop about the history, not only of the Spanish flu, the London cholera epidemic, the plagues in Europe. Urbanization has been a stronger force than all of those. And I have to tell you, I've been doing this work for 40 years now, almost 40 years since I was a graduate student. Started graduate school in 1979. In all of those 40 years, I never gave a second thought to the effect of pandemic or infectious disease on urban patterns, on city growth, on the growth of our suburbs and rural areas, and how to build strong economies, on chamber work or economic development work. Let me tell you this. My dad was born in 1921. My mom was born in 1926. They were the youngest members of their respective families of 7 kids each. That means almost all my aunts and uncles were born during the Spanish flu. No one even mentioned it. They talked about the Great Depression all the time and how hard it was. And my dad, he only had one toy and they rewrapped it every holiday. Moreover, my mother was pregnant with me. I was born in 1957. My mother was pregnant with me during the pandemic of 1957, which killed over 100,000 Americans, a lot of babies. They never told me. So that tells you something, that we forget these events, but they don't destroy the dynamic of urban growth, of urban economic development. They make our work in chamber work, economic development work, talent attraction work, business recruitment and retention work more important. But the main point I'm going to get to is that strategic and intentional action matters. Of course, we had to do that. And boy, your mayor looked great, taking a position, writing that great New York Times op-ed. Tulsa looks great. Tulsa has momentum with what you've done with that Tulsa remote program, with the press you're getting, but not during just the period of lockdown and social distancing. Actually, when the intentional action really matters is as we reopen, as you're convening now, these conversations about how to reopen safely. I'm working with several cities, big cities, small cities, cities from the size of New York and Toronto and Miami, working with you guys in Northwest Arkansas. So a whole range of cities on how to do that right. But I think even most importantly, how do you develop a recovery framework? You know, if you think about natural disaster work, if this was a hurricane, first you got to fix this stuff and get people safe and rescue. That's the lockdown. Then you got to get back on your feet and reopen, clear the streets and make sure people can, trucks can get around and people get back to their homes and start to rebuild. But then there's the recovery. Everyone we've been talking about in Tulsa is how do we grow a new kind of economy? Tulsa had a great run in oil and gas and heavy industry. I lived in Ohio. I lived in Pittsburgh for nearly 20 years. Pittsburgh had a heavy industry economy in steel. Became a post-industrial economy around universities and software and robots and high tech and self-driving cars. Now is the opportunity. They say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Now is the time to really think about what kind of Tulsa you want to be. What kind of economy do you want to be coming out of this? And how do you begin to think about that economy in a new way? Or accelerate the changes you were already making. So that's what I want to talk about. Look, a little bit of background just to set up. People are talking about big cities being hit. There was a New York Times story today on New York, another one, well, it's centered in New York. Look, there's no doubt that dense cities like New York got clobbered with this darn thing. They have a lot of tourists, they have a lot of travel, they have 3 airports, they have people coming in from everywhere, London, Madrid. But New York isn't the only kind of place that got clobbered. My wife is from Detroit. All of her siblings and most of my kids' cousins live in Detroit. Places that were tightly linked to China through industrial supply chains, like Northern Italy. Now, Detroit has an automotive supply chain. Northern Italy does have an automotive supply chain, but it's a lot of luxury goods, purses and clothing and fashion and shoes that are made between. And there are a lot of Chinese workers and factories that go between. And then jet set ski places. I mean, one of the big propagators of this, and still some of the places that have suffered the most, are the ski slopes of the US Rockies in Colorado and Idaho, and the European Alps. It is clear now as we look at the data that this darn virus reinforces many of the things we've been talking about in our country. It magnifies the class and racial divides that we have been up against. Look, we are lucky. We're on this Zoom. I've been doing Zoominars. I'm a professional worker. I'm a professor. I kind of work remotely most of the time. You know, I loved coming to visit you, and I love getting on a plane and going to visit great cities like Tulsa, but I didn't go to the office all that much. I had a nice office, but I didn't go there that much. I worked at home, writing, talking to people, you know, doing Skype calls. Now we do Zooms. We are lucky. We can isolate ourselves and our families. But, you know, and that they say as many as 40% of Americans can do that, American workers, as much as 40%. But 30 million of us, the frontline service workers, you know, the true heroes of this pandemic, the people, I haven't been to a store since March 15th. Think about that. I mean, it's just, I haven't been to a store. If I needed a pharmacy, somebody went and got it. If I needed a grocery delivery, somebody goes and gets it. Instacart, this one, that one, Uber Eats, whatever it is, Foodora. But these heroes of ours who go to get this are on the front lines and exposed to the virus. And if they live in a big city, they're the ones on transit, they're the ones on a bus. And also when people talk about density, I just want to make this clear. There are two kinds of density. I wrote a whole essay on this. There's poor place density, where people are crammed and crowded into tenements and have to work on the front lines and take transit. And there's rich place density. I'm in a condominium. It's not a very big condominium. And I can shelter in place just fine in an apartment. Even when the elevator comes, there's hardly ever anybody in it if I let it go, and get stuff delivered. So there's different kinds of density. It's not just density, which leads me to the next slide. What makes some places more vulnerable than others? Density is one factor, and it is a factor in propagation, and it's always been a factor in propagation of infectious disease. But there are other factors. And not just how quick you lock down. That's important, but it's, you know, look at, you know, Sweden comes up. I actually wrote a piece on Sweden. If we want to talk about it more in questions, I've done a lot of work on Sweden. One of my main collaborators is a Swedish woman. We've written many dozen papers together. But Sweden never did lock down. And you know, some communities lock down more than others. But there's characteristic of places that make some places more vulnerable than others. Age. Northern Italy is one of the oldest places on the planet. If you're old, we now know that 80 to 90% of the fatalities of this darn thing came to people over 70. Class. If you have resources, if you have high incomes, if you have high levels of education, you know, people say, well, San Francisco wasn't as hard hit as New York. San Francisco and New York are completely different places. San Francisco is the richest, most highly educated metropolitan area in the United States. It has the highest percentage of people who work remotely and the lowest percentage of frontline workers. New York is more like Detroit. No, it's different. It's a big city in terms of its economic mix, in terms of its frontline workers, in terms of racially concentrated poverty, than it is like San Francisco. Health and fitness. Western cities like San Francisco, like Los Angeles, like Denver, like Seattle are just healthier. People are younger. They work out more. They're slimmer. They're trimmer. There's less obesity. There's less heart disease. One of the things a lot of urbanists have bemoaned is the childless city. San Francisco and Seattle, they've said, and Washington, D.C. are cities that don't have a lot of children. They're too expensive. Well, guess what? Children are vectors. Cities that have fewer children have fewer vectors, multi-generational families. I look at Italy, which was so hard hit. It is the example of a place that has high levels of I'm Italian American, high level of multi-generational families where mom, dad, kids, and grandpa see each other all the time and often live together. Religiosity, places that are more religious, not only Christian and Catholic like me in New York. The Hasidic community and Orthodox communities just devastated because churches and funerals and collective gatherings. And finally, social capital. All the things we like about a tightly knit social capital community with multiple generations and religiosity. This great young demographer, Lyman Stone, wrote on Twitter, one of the great tragedies of the virus is that it will end up that places that have stronger social capital actually got sicker. Now, how will the virus reshape our cities and communities? How might it reshape Tulsa? And here, I think, it's early days. I'm writing a big feature for The Atlantic. It should be out in the next month. You'll all get to read it, hopefully. Hopefully you will read it. But the way I parse this is that there are push and pull factors, and it's hard to tell which of them is going to be stronger in advance. Depending how long this goes on, the balance of those forces may change. If it's over quickly, if we have good antiviral therapies, and look, we're getting them. We're getting them now, some drugs that seem to work. If we get a vaccine, they're testing vaccines now. I read, because I actually was, I have a healthcare provider at NYU Langone in New York City. NYU Langone is testing a vaccine now. Can you believe it? And I heard today that other hospitals are testing the convalescent plasma already. Now, that may take a year, 2 years, 3 years, who knows? But if we can compress it with antiviral therapies or a vaccine, the balance of these forces will change. First, there are pull factors. Remote work. Look, it is clear that remote work is here to stay, and you in Tulsa have made a big bet on it, and it looks like that bet's going to pay off more than you thought. I mean, the whole experiment with Tulsa Remote, which is a fantastic program, and has gotten Aaron and others, Kaiser, it has gotten tremendous press for good reason. It's a great program. I think it's the first thing that I heard about. The gathering place in Tulsa Remote were the things that were percolating up into ether that I was hearing about before I even came to start to get to know you better. But look, when I come to Tulsa, I see people from New York, from Chicago, from San Francisco, from Dallas, and not just boomerangs, not just Tulsans. People who've come there for the opportunities and the ability to buy an affordable house. That's going to play to your strength. I hear this. I thought I knew people who were apartment and condo dwellers. If they have a family, to a person, they are saying, I have to get someplace where I can have a house with a lawn, with a swing set, with some toys and a backyard and maybe a pool for my kids. That plays to your strengths. Fear of mass transit. We see it in New York. Everyone who could afford got out. They got to the Hamptons, to Hudson, they went wherever. They went to visit relatives all throughout the country. As I mentioned, desire for private amenity, a backyard, a play area. And I think the other thing that benefits Oklahoma, maybe not Tulsa, maybe some parts of Tulsa, I think we're going to see a wave of rural gentrification. A lot of the people I know who bailed out from New York didn't go from the suburbs. They went to the Hudson Valley and rural towns. If you watch that movie about the band that's on, Once We Were Brothers, it's a documentary now. They go to Woodstock. That's the kind of place they're heading to. But there's going to be push factors. High-tech clusters, finance, entertainment, media industries benefit from clustering. They're not going to break up and fragment all over the place. They're going to still cluster, especially if air travel is restricted and it's going to be harder to bomb in and out. The other thing that I think is that what's happening in downtown Tulsa, you think about the renovation and revitalization that's going on, but think in a bigger city like Chicago or Dallas, or Chicago in particular, people are scared to get on a train or transit. Some will go out to the suburbs and work remotely, and I think we'll see a second day for office parks. I do. I think suburban office parks, regional office centers where people can commute quicker, will have a second life. It may not be forever, but they'll have a second life for a few years. But if you're a walkable or bikeable area close to an urban center with a cluster of industries, I think you're going to see those rise. Like in New York, the Tribecas, the Sohos, those places are going to go up in value, where the places on the transit stops may go down in value. Now, what do we really want to talk about? How can our cities in Tulsa in particular not only reopen, I think I want to spend a few minutes on reopening, but what can we think about now? I want to provoke you, and we'll have time to talk more. What can we do now to think about recovery? And look, we've been behind the 8 ball on all of this. But my dad told me this. My dad said this is the way Americans are. My dad, when he signed up for World War II, the day Pearl Harbor was bombed, he said, down in Newark, New Jersey, they gave him a broomstick and a doughboy helmet. And he's like, what the hell? How am I going to fight Germans with a broomstick? He said, by the time he was deployed in England, getting ready to go storm the beaches, get on the transport to storm the beaches at Normandy, he said, Richard, we had everything you can imagine. We had munitions, supplies, armaments, food. We never wanted for anything. We start behind the 8 ball, but we mobilize quickly. And we don't do this everyone says it's the federal government, it's this one, it's that one, it's whatever, red, blue, this. We mobilize locally, we mobilize state, we mobilize private sector, philanthropic sector, foundation, but we get it done. And I think this is what we have to think about now. How do we mobilize to do the best recovery we can, the reopening we can? And how now do we start to plan to make our communities stronger as we recover? Test, trace, and tweak, 3 T's. Everyone in this country is talking about testing and tracing. And wouldn't it be great? I've been tested, by the way. It cost me a pretty penny. I got tested both for the virus and for the antibodies. And fortunately and unfortunately, I was negative for both. So we are gearing up testing. There are testing centers coming online and cheaper tests. They're even doing not a swab test, a saliva test. But we're not going to be able to test and trace everyone. And Americans, we're antsy and we're not fearful. It's amazing to me. Americans don't scare easily. We want to get back to work and we don't want to be sitting around with 20% unemployment. And we're willing to take some risks. I think that's what we're seeing now. People are saying, if I'm young, if I'm able-bodied, of course I'm going to stay away from elders. We're going to have to isolate people who are vulnerable. We got to take really much better care of our nursing homes, and everyone botched that, including the Europeans. But we have to redesign to reopen. We have to redesign our civic assets, our economic assets, our infrastructure, our communities, our open spaces, so that we can reopen safely and securely and build in protection, build in safety, and build in physical distancing. So here's what I want to talk about, 3 stages. Stage 1 is where we are now. How do we reopen initially? Stage 2, I don't know. You're probably ahead of most places because Tulsa hasn't been whacked as hard as some. When do you start to more broadly reopen key assets? And the assets I would put are, the BOK Center, the arenas, the universities, colleges, community college, the airport, transit hubs. And then right now, how do we begin to think about economic recovery? Because our economy has been so down in the dumps, and in your case, oil and gas has been so hard hit. How do we prepare for a better economy that's both more resilient and more inclusive, that's not as divided, and that creates better prosperity for more people? And we like this graph. We developed it from with our friends. I know they're working in Tulsa at HRNA, the consulting firm, talking a lot about this. But if you just go to status quo, you look at the dip in the economy and the comeback, they barely get back to where you were. But we're dipping now, and we're going to dip. Maybe we'll dip a little further. But if we start to do things right, if we reopen carefully, if we design for resiliency and for social distancing, if we reopen carefully and we develop a recovery framework, which is the best it can be, we can come out ahead of the game. We can not only have better innovation and better productivity, but greater prosperity. So what do we want to do in Tulsa as we think about your initial reopening? A crisis is a terrible thing to waste. We have now an opportunity to redesign open spaces, streets and roads, and great open spaces such as the gathering place, so that they can be safe and secure places for people. One of the things that's really galled me is when I've seen police in the parks. I saw this in Toronto with the Cherry Blossom Festival. Cherry blossoms are a big deal in Toronto. The police went into the park and started issuing tickets because they said people weren't socially distancing. Well, there are very few cases of transmission outside. In fact, in China, there's only 1 documented case of transmission outside. It was 2 people having a conversation for like an hour. Most cases of transmission are inside. The preponderance of them are amongst family members. So if you're pushing people who are a family from the outside to the inside, you're making it worse. It's on a transit, like a subway or a train, or in a very contained environment like a funeral home or a church or a temple. Even restaurants, I don't want to get it, even the Chinese data, there has been transmission in restaurants. There has been transmission, but very limited. By the way, and I don't know the answer to this, I would say you look at it, because I've looked at almost every study. The Swedes did not close the schools. And they did not close the schools because they not only felt that was bad for parents, they felt it was bad for kids. And the studies of kids who were born during the Spanish flu show social scarring. The psychological scarring, because the parents in that era were afraid to touch the kids. They thought they were going to give them the Spanish flu. These kids bear social scars. But there is very limited evidence that this is passed on in schools. Even though we consider schools to be vectors, I have not seen, and if you see, please, Florida Creative Class, send me some. But maybe we can, and I noticed in Korea, I noticed they're actually doing classes outside. We can do a lot more outside. That's a really important thing. Henry Graybar, one of our former City Lab alums, said, I went to the great coffee shop in Tulsa. Oh God, I'm blanking on the name. And you park right outside. It was raining that day and I ran inside. Henry was saying, set up the parking lots as outdoor cafes. What a magnificent idea. People feel scared dining inside, move them outdoors. So when I say open space, it's not just a gathering place, but small scale parklets, streets, Lithuania said it's going to be a city of cafes. You could redesign the streets and sidewalks, take away, not forever, but for a limited time, maybe put in a valet service, take away the parking and let the restaurants spill the tables onto the street. Ensure that Main Street survives. Obviously, financial support, economic support, that's really critical. You don't want to go down Tulsa with block after block of empty storefront. But the large retailers know what to do. The small retailers are going to need help. And one of the things we've been talking about a little bit with the mayor, with the foundation, hopefully with you all, is the chamber could help here. They're going to need technical assistance. What kind of business model makes sense? You know, as you move to more delivery and takeout, you move the tables from inside to outside, even retail, you know, you might have to set up things, racks on the streets, like a sale. What kind of technical assistance do you need to have safe social distancing and health and safety checks? And one of the things I found here is medical professionals are great at this. You know, get doctors, get dentists, get dermatologists to help you in the retail sector. Really think about it, because they're thinking about how to reopen their practices because they have to reopen. How do I do this in a retail environment or a Main Street business? The arts and creative economy. Boy, oh boy, when I think of Tulsa as a city of arts. There ain't going to be a Taylor Swift concert. There ain't going to be a Rolling Stone show to go to. There ain't going to be a Frozen thing, Disney thing for me to take my girls to. There aren't going to be big, large-scale concerts, but you could have locally sourced culture. You could have it on every street corner. And, you know, with all of the musicians, you could be thinking about hire a Tulsa musician, hire a Tulsa performer, hire a Tulsa chef or restaurant to do your block party or a community gathering. Take one of those parking lots, create a program so there's music and arts on every street corner that creates that kind of sidewalk ballet. Create an online portal that people can go to, not just to see a YouTube video of local Tulsa arts and culture, but book a performer for their event. I think activating Tulsa over the summer with arts and creativity so that people can be outside, almost like, you know, a block party every day of the week at lunch hour or whatever, and certainly on the weekends, is something that would get people. Now, how do you start to think about the broader reopening over the summer and fall? I've been talking to some of your higher education leaders. Really interesting thinking on their part. But, you know, universities, colleges, TU, OSU Tulsa, OU Tulsa, Tulsa Community College are key anchors of our community. They attract talent, they attract students, they create a 24/7 buzz. I mean, I have something coming out in the Wall Street Journal on the weekend, which you'll all see, written with a guy who's a higher education expert, talking the way in which universities led the urban revival of the past 2 decades. New York wouldn't have come back without NYU and Columbia. LA, downtown LA would be dead without USC. Chicago, we could go on and on. Pittsburgh, the whole Pittsburgh Renaissance was based on universities. They are real anchor institutions. We talk about Philadelphia, the actions of the University of Pennsylvania and Drexel and Thomas Jefferson. They created the kind of magnet that brought people back, and Tulsa was doing this too. We have to figure out ways to get them to reopen safely. And one of the things I was talking to Lee Goodson about, which I thought was amazing, was not only bringing in health and safety experts to TCC, but using the nursing students. What a great idea she had. You know, oh yeah, I can use my nursing students. They're getting a degree. They can help make sure the classrooms are safe and healthy and free from disease. And maybe we do have temperature checks. Some of it's going to have to be using health and safety screening. Temperature sensors on buildings. Folks in New York are talking about sensors in the elevators to make sure there are not too many people. How do you get the larger scale arenas like the BOK Center ready to do things? How do you get Tulsa Airport ready to reopen? And here I think it's a combination of small things like tape and circles on the floor for physical and social distancing, spacing chairs out better, doing all of that, maybe leaving some chairs empty. But I think it's also making use of PPE, personal protective equipment. And I have to say this. When it first happened, I have a 2- and 4-year-old girl, and they saw people with looking like I don't know, bandits with bandanas, you know, wrapped around their face, and a mask, a surgical mask, and you know that hood. You know, when one of my kids had to go to the pediatrician, and it came in with a hazmat suit. My kids were in tears. And you see it now on your UPS driver. You see it when you get a delivery. If somebody goes, you don't have to do that. We have a fashion and design community in this country. You have one in Tulsa. We can make it look good. We can make it look non-obtrusive. We can design it so it's made in Tulsa, made in New York, made in LA. You go to a nice hotel in Tulsa, you go to a nice hotel when you visit, you get on an airplane, a UPS guy wears a uniform. Make it part of the damn uniform so people aren't scared to death. And now, what do we do in stage 3, economic recovery? Look, this is stuff we've all been talking about. You've been talking about, you care deeply about, you're doing. But now is kind of the time that the crisis really creates the breathing room. Now, it's terrible that we have it. We'd rather not have it. Who wants to deal with tens of millions? Who knows what that jobs report is going to, it's not going to be good tomorrow. We don't want to see this kind of unemployment. We don't want to see a depression. But look, it's here. We have to make the best of it. Why not rethink our economic framework? Why not put everything on the table now? And you know, one of the great things about economic crises is they clear away the stuff that was dying anyway, and they prepare the soil for new growth. So what are you going to do to deal with the decline of oil and gas? And remember, I lived through this in Pittsburgh, so I know about steel, and I know how much we did to try to save steel, and how much we still call ourselves the Pittsburgh Steelers, for Christ's sakes, and a steel town. How do you begin to think about what comes next? And what may be the future of oil and gas? How do you focus on growth sectors? I know Tulsa Innovation Labs, those folks have been talking about new growth sectors. You have a great capability in cybersecurity. You might be a place that can do things like telemedicine. Telemedicine is very interesting. You know, I've been talking to a lot of my friends that are doctors. All those regulatory things that inhibited doctors from working across state boundaries are gone. I know my friends who are doctors all over the country are now working in New York. Now, they're not working physically in New York, they're doing telemedicine in New York. All of my healthcare over the past couple of months has been telemedicine. And, you know, I like it. I mean, who wants to go to the doctor's office? You don't have to. One of the things I've been big on, and Bill and Mike know this, we've talked a lot about it, is not only thinking about the industry sectors and business attraction, the talent piece, and how do you both attract and retain and kind of rebuild and upgrade talent. Now, obviously, Tulsa, one big part of your talent strategy has been remote. And I love remote work. The reason I like remote work is I think it's going to be a big kicker. I think just more and more of us are going to do it. I think Tulsa has a brand around it. I think you've shown that people like coming to Tulsa, and there's a multiplier effect. They attract others. But let's say you could get 10 to 20% of your workforce doing remote work, maybe a little more. That's good because it gives you a different kind of resiliency. It makes you 10 to 20% of your economy is no longer local. And maybe you can attract those tech companies, those Googles, those Amazons, those Microsofts to say, not only individuals, we'll give you a group. There's a bunch of people who are dissatisfied with living in our expensive cities. They'd love to come to Tulsa. We'll help market Tulsa to them. So maybe you can boost it. And one of the things that Tulsa Remote has taught us is it's not just about the affordable house. That's a part of it. And it's not just about the $10,000 grant. It's about coming to a community and being part of a community. You know how to do that as well as anyone. But also upgrading those skills. When we did an analysis of talent clusters in Detroit, what we found is Detroit wasn't an automotive economy. It was an industrial design economy. And Detroit's concentration of industrial designers and industrial engineers was bigger than San Francisco's. When we looked at Houston's economy through this lens, we found that Houston wasn't just an oil and gas and refining economy. It had a concentration of software engineers that was second or third in the country who were working in oil and gas. When you look at the lens of occupational or talent clusters, it's not the only lens. Industry clusters and business attraction are critical. It gives you a second lens, a second slice to bring through your economy to think about. Now I think is the time and to really think about improving jobs and wages for service workers. We know that our economy has been divided between knowledge workers and service workers. You're lucky that you have, I met at one of your chamber meetings, the CEO of Quick Trip. You have a leading edge CEO there that has taken it upon himself and his company to upgrade service work, to develop internal career ladders, to hire and train from within, to build up capabilities. Look, our service workers are telling us we need better PPE. Our workers in the meatpacking plants are saying, protect us. make the line safe so that the company is safe, so that you have food. Pay us better. Look, I'm doing all I can. I'm giving a 20% plus tip to every frontline service worker who comes to my house. As a country, we decided in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, we would pay factory workers like my dad more. My dad made eyeglasses. We pay more for a set of frames. We paid more for a car, more for a TV set, more for a washer dryer. So people like my dad could buy a house and have the American dream. I'm happy to pay a little bit more for a burger. Gas is cheap. I'm happy to pay a few cents more to fill up my car. I'm happy to pay a little more, for delivery, so that a middle class can be recreated in our country. And I think more and more of us are seeing that. And then finally, and look, Tulsa has been a leader in this too. So this is playing to so many of your strengths. I mean, Mike Bloomberg, during his presidential campaign, came to Tulsa to announce the Greenwood Initiative, a process of more inclusive racial healing in our country. And Tulsa has been leading the nation in this conversation. We know that race and class have been key factors in this pandemic. The trauma that the Black community, the less advantaged community, but particularly the African-American community has felt has been heart-rending, heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. Such a big burden of this pandemic has been borne by the less advantaged and minority communities. It's time to prioritize this, not just because it's the right thing to do, not just because it's the moral thing to do, because it's going to make all of our communities safer for all of us. Anyway, it looks like the little clock on the wall has told me I've come to my end of my time. Thank you for your patience in listening to me. It's always a pleasure to be back. I hope to see you in person soon and look forward to your questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Richard, for sharing your insight and expertise. You've given us all so much to think about as we reopen and as we become leaders to move Tulsa forward. We have some questions for today. So now I'm going to pass it over to Bill to moderate those questions and answer session. Bill? Bill, are you there?
Hey, Bill, you're muted.
So we had a couple of questions come in prior to your presentation that I think you may have some thoughts on. Specifically, what shifts in the workplace skill sets do you see as a result of the pandemic?
Wow, that's a great question. I think the big one is the ability, well, obviously there's several. The ability to work effectively remotely. And, I was telling you this, like with the background and with the lighting. And I mean, I made a big shift in my own skill set. I don't, often reskill, but just the skills to be better at doing remote work. I think that's a big new one. And the ability to communicate remotely and to build teams remotely. Look, if you can do that, you're going to be golden. If you're not, I would say that's the biggest one. Communicate effectively, build teams, and work remotely. The other skill is going to be frontline work. Frontline work. As we're engaging in an economic depression and a job shedding, we're hiring hundreds of thousands of delivery workers to get stuff to people. So I think the other big skill is going to be being effective at delivery. And that's going to shift our country a lot, and not just the ability to drive a car, but the ability to supervise and work on delivery, the ability to really, deal with logistics. And, the one we were talking about with Nick and Tulsa Innovation Labs was drones. Now that's a skill down the road. But clearly we're going to have to think about other mechanisms for delivery. So, but I think the big one, if I had to put one of them, we mentioned telemedicine. I think a lot of how do you do stuff online that gives you some facsimile of the real world? I think that's going to be a big one. And in that sense, Tulsa with Tulsa Remote has a little bit of a leg up there.
Great, thank you. This question comes to us from Chase Beasley with American Airlines. Do you think manufacturing has a role to play in the future of Tulsa's economic growth?
I do. I think we're going to see some repatriation of manufacturing for sure. I think we've realized that we can't outsource our entire supply chain. And I think there's two visions of that. Let me tell you what I think they are. One vision is Americans are going to do it and American companies are going to do it. Maybe. I think the better vision is what happened. I studied this, by the way, Chase. My original career was studying the rebirth of manufacturing when I lived in Ohio and Pittsburgh. I did many studies of the rebirth of American manufacturing in the 80s and 90s. What I learned in that is that we invited, including President Reagan, it's interesting, back to President Reagan, also President Bush, President Clinton, all of them, invited in the best foreign manufacturers, but on our soil. Don't send the stuff in across the seas. Bring a Honda plant, a Toyota plant, a semiconductor chip plant. Do it in America with American workers, sometimes JV'd with an American. I saw it in steel. So many of the American steel companies then joint ventured with Japanese rubber and tire, with good Japanese companies, supplier, second and third tier suppliers. And what happened is we rebuilt our manufacturing might. My brother-in-law in Detroit works for Broza, one of the best German first-tier suppliers. So I think the better way to do it is not to say we're just going to bring back American companies. We want to invite in the best manufacturers to work in America with Americans. And yes, I think now look, is manufacturing going to solve all of our woes? I think direct production occupations are about 6% of America. If we can tilt that back up to 10, that'd be great. That would be fantastic. But we're still going to have to do more. But yes, I do think manufacturing can play a role in Tulsa's future.
Great. One of our questions from one of our regional partners, Chelsea Lebo-Feary, regarding the push and pull factors, how can Tulsa work with the suburbs and vice versa to build collaboration instead of competitiveness?
100%. You know, you guys have played the Tulsa Regional Chamber. Think about it. You've played a big role in that. And I think it's a wake-up call, right? I live in Toronto, and I'm part of Toronto Global. Our suburbs were saying a lot of the companies want to be in downtown Toronto. Make them move to the suburbs. You can't make them move to the suburbs. You can't make them move to the city. They're going to go where they want to go. But you can work together. And I think as cities come under fiscal stress, right, that the big thing that's going to happen here is taxes and revenues are going to decline across the board. Cities are going to experience real budget stress. So they're going to have to, we saw this in Pittsburgh. One of the few ways we could get regional collaboration is when a city started to go broke. So it may be in this fiscal stress, there are certain services we can combine. Now, I don't know what they are in advance. You would know better. What are the things we can do better and create economies of scale? And what are the things that are best done locally? And let's not waste money. Let's not be, beggar thy neighbor, putting up an incentive program that says Tulsa's going to compete against the suburb or two suburbs are going to compete. It's going to benefit no one. And let's combine the other thing I will say is this consortium of states may be useful here. Even though they formed it to deal with PPE and recovery, the states may say, hold on, we have to use our resources wisely. Let's program them in a better way. So yeah, I think cooperation is the way, and let's start now.
Great. Maybe a time for maybe one or two more questions. Again, from our friend, this is one really struck me as particularly interesting. Do you think we're going to see, you mentioned the potential of the rebirth of the suburban office parks. Do you think we're going to see more master planned communities outside of large urban areas like the Woodlands outside of Houston?
We could. I mean, we could see a reinvention of the suburbs. Like I'm working with a lot of big New York real estate developers, and some of those developers have big portfolios of office buildings in the city, but they also were trying to build regional office centers near transit hubs. You could see some reallocation of that in the near term. You could see people saying, well, Tulsa is different because you don't have that tremendous traffic congestion of Houston or Dallas or Toronto or New York. You get around, like you get around pretty easily, but still people might say, I want to be closer to home. So I think, and malls are going to be in trouble too. I think that you're going to have this opportunity now. Neiman Marcus filed for bankruptcy today to repurpose these places. You're going to have some interesting real estate plays and opportunities. But yes, specifically, I think that more people are going to want private amenity. I was talking to a guy today who lives in a community in Connecticut, and he was saying he's bummed out because he lives in an HOA and the pool isn't open and the tennis courts aren't open and he can't use the stuff and he wish he had a backyard. I think this is where there's going to be some demand for this. And it may not be forever. Things may, 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road change again. But yeah, I think we've been looking for a new kind of suburb. We really have, funny, urbanist little joke here. People think that Joel Kotkin and I are diametrically opposed, that we don't get along. We're actually very close friends. And Joel and I always joke amongst ourselves. I tend to live but I live in a single family home. I have a condo for vacation purpose, but I live in a single family home in an urban neighborhood. And when it's safe, I ride my bike. Joel lives in a town in Southern California, which is a smaller town, but he rides his bike to work. We kind of live in the same, I might live in a bigger city called Toronto. He may live in Orange, California, but our day-to-day lives are pretty much the same. Does that make sense to everybody? I think people are looking for this new kind of place that has attributes of a city, but which is a suburb. And I think the pandemic, you know, you don't want to be too far from stuff. I think the pandemic will create those models. It doesn't appear that the pandemic is really damaging the housing market yet. People are still going out and renting and buying. So yeah, I think for Tulsa, especially where single family is affordable, where you can build single family affordably, yeah, there's a time to really play around with new models of single family home delivery and community building. Like you said, these placemaking master plan communities.
Great. One last question. We'll end it on a talent, since this is our talent strategy symposium. What implications will this virus have on high school and college students who are about to enter the workforce?
Well, Ken Levitt and I talked about this, and I actually wrote about it in the Wall Street Journal. I have a nephew. My nephew's my eldest nephew. He has a scholarship to play football for the University of Chicago. I hope he's not listening in. I doubt he is. I'm heartbroken to tell him he's probably not going to go back to school in the fall. I don't know how you're going to open colleges in the fall. I really don't. I think community colleges can reopen. I think they can and have classes spread out. Dorms and dining halls are very vexing. When you think about how do you, now I know Mitch Daniels at Purdue, maybe, let's hope to God it can happen. But if it doesn't happen, what happens? Tulsa's always complained about the brain drain of the best and brightest kids from Tulsa going to Boston or New York, or wherever the hell they go. Those kids are going to be in Tulsa. So one of the things I mentioned in this Wall Street Journal is an AmeriCorps-like initiative for those kids. We'll get them involved. Get them hooked up with the chamber, create internships with the Kaiser Family Foundation, get them involved working with the mayor, get them hooked on their town, or maybe some of them want to go. The other one thing we talk about is maybe there's some rural colleges in safe parts of the country, and they want to go back to campus, and they go, well, I'll do a domestic study away. I'll go to a rural town out somewhere in Oklahoma and work there. There's a lot of ways to do this, but I think in the high school kids, get them involved. I mean, what an opportunity, especially with remote learning, oh my God. Get them involved somehow in outdoor activities that they can be part of this rebuilding. I say one last thing about that, an opportunity you have. And I'm doing some work with the Walton family in Northwest Arkansas. They've been really concerned in trying to build up the University of Arkansas. You've been trying to build up your higher education with the 4 or 5 different providers. But here's what I told them. You have a tremendous opportunity in Fayetteville. I taught at NYU. I live in Toronto now and have a house, and I commute to work. At NYU, I had faculty housing. Do you know what faculty housing at NYU is? It's a 1,100 square foot apartment in a 30-story tower where the elevator is packed with people every day. You are literally like this. I said, there are going to be so many professors at places like NYU. No, not the young ones. The young ones are going to be fine. They love New York. They want the artists and the musicians. But there'll be people with families who are saying, it's scary now. I said, University of Arkansas, just go full out. Just go full out with recruitment packages to top level star talent and say, if you come to the University of Arkansas, we'll outfit your lab. You know what I'm saying? Give you research support. I think there's opportunities for talent recruitment now that there have never been. And what works to your favor is this rise of the rest vibe that's been going on in the country. And people were getting tired of the expensive city, getting tired of spending all that money. And you know, people, you hear them say it all the time. I've been to the restaurants now more times than I can say. I don't need to go the umpteenth time. I want to live in a nice place. I think there's a talent attraction opportunity that's never been in my life in America. Those smaller communities like you, like Northwest, it's not every smaller community. The ones that have the gathering place, that have the restaurants, that have the coffee shops, that have the co-working spaces, that have everything I see in Tulsa, you can now use that to leverage. So yeah, I think it's a once in a lifetime talent attraction thing, and it's gonna be here probably for 6 to 18 months, and I'd go like crazy after it.
Great, thank you, Richard. Before I turn it back over to Rue to wrap things up, I know Mike Neal wants to have a brief thank you.
Richard, on behalf of the Chamber, let me just say thank you so much for inspiring us, for motivating us, for sharing your wisdom, your insight. I know that you're a very popular speaker. My good friend Jeff Finkel, the International Economic Development Council, IEDC, was just bragging on you earlier this week. We're honored that you would come take part with us in Tulsa on multiple occasions during this week. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your partnership with GKFF, with Walton Foundation. I think the more opportunities that we can collaborate here in Northeast Oklahoma, in Northwest Arkansas, for the good of this, if you will, this super region, the better off we'll all be. So thank you again. We always look forward to having you back with us.